Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video here, and then for today's video we're going to go ahead and take a walk down memory lane as we take a look at the Moto G series. Now, just a quick rundown, the Moto G series has always been Motorola's mid-card, mid-range options for those people who are budget conscious but still wanted a pretty solid device to use. Now, we're going to look at the evolution state of the Moto G as from its very humble beginnings with the Moto G1 all the way up to the Moto G7, which, crazy enough as it is, it's actually stepped up all these years. And this is one of the lines of Moto devices that I say you can see the increase in its production. So we start off with the Moto G1, which looks pretty basic. As you guys can see, the device sports a 4.5-inch display at 720 by 1280, so that's 720p, not full HD resolution. Has a 5-megapixel camera on the back. Was running the Snapdragon 400 chip, and it had 1 gig of RAM, as well as a 2070 mAh battery. So nothing really jaw-dropping or wow factor. It did start off at 4.3 Jelly Bean and was upgradable all the way to 5.1.1 Lollipop. Again, with this one, there was an 8 or 16 gigabyte internal storage variant, but both options had 1 gig of RAM only. Now, not too bad, and I believe this one had the Moto shell where you can change out the back cover, and so that was always something that was pretty interesting and unique. Could be wrong, but if I remember correctly, it did have that. So now that we're looking at that, we're going to go ahead and go to the Moto G2. It's a second generation variant, which kind of stepped up a little bit, as you guys can see, with those front firing speakers, which is always a cool thing. People love that front firing speaker. Its screen size did move up with a 5-inch display at 720 by 1280, so it's still 720p, not full HD. 8-megapixel rear camera, still using the Snapdragon 400 chip, a 2070 mAh battery. I believe this one had 2 variations as well, but it did start off at 4.4.4 KitKat and was upgradable up to Marshmallow. Actually, this one only had 1 variant also as well. It was 8 gigs of internal storage with 1 gigabyte of RAM, and yeah, not too shabby. I mean, again, it was still in its earlier stages, so it was a low mid-ranger that I would actually consider it as, but still was good for the money. It was good if you were looking for a good budget option phone. Now we move our way up to the Moto G3, third generation device in the Moto G series. This one still boasted a 5-inch display at 720 by 1280, so 720p display, a 13 megapixel rear camera. This one moved up with 2 gigabytes of RAM and also changed the processing chip now that it was using the Snapdragon 410 and had a 2470 mAh battery. This device basically started off at 5.1.1 Lollipop and was upgradable to 6.0 Marshmallow. And there were 2 versions of this one. They had the 8 gig with 1 gigabyte of RAM, and then there was a 16 gig with 2 gigabytes of RAM. So options here, and that's one of the things I love about Motorola. You get options, and you can't argue with that. So a pretty solid device, but still built out of plastic, and that Moto dimple was kind of unique, kind of paired off with the camera. But anyways, that would be the Moto G3. Moving on next, we're going to be looking at the Moto G4. Now, this device did move up its display size to a 5.5-inch display, and also the resolution was 1080 by 1920. So this device actually sported the first full HD display with 2 gigs of RAM, and it was using the Snapdragon 617 with a 3000 mAh battery. Now, this one started off at 6.0.1 Marshmallow and moved its way up to 7.0 Nougat. And there were 2 options. There was a 16 gig option and a 32 gig option, but both had 2 gigs of RAM. So either way, it was just basically the storage change and nothing drastic over that. All in all, this one kind of resembled the Nexus 6 just a little bit, just the way the design wise was. But other than that, I mean, it was still a pretty good option if you were trying to save some money but still have a pretty decent device. And so now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the 5th variation, which is the Moto G5. Now, the Moto G5 kind of went a little bit smaller as a display size with a 5-inch display, 1080 by 1920. It did have a 13 megapixel rear-facing camera and had 3 gigabytes of RAM. The chipset that was being used was a Snapdragon 430, and it had a 2800 milliamp hour battery. So something scaled down from the G4. However, this device did start off at Nougat and made its way to 8.1 Oreo. And there were two different versions. The 16 gigabyte version had 2 gigs of RAM, and the 32 gig option had 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now, a lot of people had nothing but good things to say about the Moto G5. Its build quality, its performance was really good. One that I did not get to own, but pretty solid, and you could tell it was starting to step its game up quite a bit. So the next device we take a look at is the Moto G6. Now this one basically changed with the new 18:9 aspect ratio display. So it had a 5.7-inch display, 1080 by 2160 pixels. You had a 12 megapixel camera on the back. It had dual cameras on the back actually for depth and field. 4 gigs of RAM according. Snapdragon 450 and a 3000 mAh battery. Now, I had the Play version of this, and I can tell you that I really loved the Moto G6 Play. In the Moto G6, the normal one would actually be something that a lot of people would definitely rant and rave about. This device, basically, you know, it had a 64 gigs with 4 gigs of RAM and a 32 gigs with 3 gigabytes of RAM. And I believe right now it's on Android Pie, so it started off on Oreo and made its way to Pie. And so with that brings us to the most recently released Moto G7. Now the Moto G7, there's a lot of unboxings going on YouTube right now. This device is absolutely gorgeous. I went to Best Buy to play around with one today, and it's extremely nice. 6.2-inch display with that 18:9 aspect ratio. You also have that teardrop camera in the front, 12 megapixel camera on the back, 4 gigs of RAM using the Snapdragon 632 and a 3000 mAh battery. Now this is for the G7. Of course, it launched with Android Pie, and it could possibly get Q in the future. But I gotta tell you guys, this one is one for the books, and I'll be doing a separate video on what I think about the Moto G7, so stay tuned for that. If you guys enjoyed the memory lane trip down with the Moto G series, drop a like to let me know. Leave your comments on which Moto G device you've owned, and if you liked it or disliked it, I would love to know that. And if you have not subscribed, please do so. Click that subscribe button. Thanks for checking out my video, and as always, everyone, aloha.